Hi, Aryeh.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm okay. How are you?
Can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, and I guess this is The Wright Show on Blogging Heads TV, but it's an unusual episode of The Wright Show. And you are Aryeh Cohen-Wade,
Correct.
familiar to many Blogging Heads fans as the host of Culturally Determined,
Mm-hmm.
and also someone who labors tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure that this is all possible.
Mm-hmm.
And also somebody has a cat behind. Is that cat perched on your shoulder?
No, she's on the top of the chair.
Huh. What's the name of the cat?
This is Grumpkin.
How do you spell that?
Grumkin.
Is the cat grumpy? Is that the basis of the name?
No, it's a Game of Thrones reference.
Oh.
And when we got her, it was a litter of cats, and she was the runt, and she was all, she was like, her eyes were crusted shut, and she was all
Yeah.
a nasty little creature. And we thought Grumpkin fit, and then we decided to keep her and kept the name because it suited her in some strange way.
Yeah. You know, I was curious about what the whole Game of Thrones thing was all about, so I finally watched an episode, and it left me curious as to what the whole Game of Thrones thing is about. Seems like Downton Abbey with sex and violence, and I didn't watch Downton Abbey either.
Yeah, you kind of have to stick with it for like 5 or 6 episodes before you can figure out what's even going on.
Yeah,
It's one of
that's
the
quite an
problems.
investment. There's a lot of stuff I could get done during that period. For example, we could have this conversation. Now, we should explain why this is an unusual conversation. This is about something called mindful resistance, which is a phenomenon I've kind of tried to get off the ground with the help of you and others, and is also, more concretely, an actual newsletter, a weekly newsletter, the Mindful Resistance newsletter. And so I guess there are at least two kinds of people watching and or listening to this. First, there are people who have no idea what I'm talking about. And then there are people who actually read the newsletter already, subscribe to it, part of our rapidly growing subscriber base. Would you call it rapidly growing?
It's almost exponential, the growth.
Thank you. Yeah. And so those people, the people who get the newsletter, know that this is a video I promised in the newsletter to do after we got some feedback from the readers of the newsletter about the direction in which the newsletter and the whole thing, the community, should evolve. And so that has happened. We've gotten feedback, and now we are going to absorb some of the feedback and respond to it. But first, maybe for the benefit of the people in the other group who don't get the newsletter, maybe we should talk a little more about mindful resistance is. What mindful resistance is. It's how would you describe it? Would you?
It's starting off with just a newsletter, but it may expand into other realms. But we're trying to come up with a more thoughtful, better, more effective, more mindful way to oppose Trumpism.
Right. Mindful in, I mean, here we get to another division in audience. There are people who meditate, who do mindfulness meditation, and became aware of this mindful resistance thing through that avenue. And then there are people who don't. But even for people who don't, you know, the word mindful is no doubt familiar, not just in the Buddhist context, but in the sense of meaning just, you know, paying attention to things that should have attention paid, and doing so in a, you know, kind of deliberate, careful, mindful way. And it seems to me that, you know, I guess this grows partly out of my sense that some of the so-called resistance to Trumpism is a little too revved up for its own good, a little too reactive, a little too reflexively outraged, because I think to some extent when you're like that, you're playing his game. If you're responding to every one of his provocations, sometimes you're playing into Trump's hands, and also just because in general, you know, I think a calm mind is a more strategically and tactically sound mind. So anyway, that's the premise behind the newsletter. That said, I don't purport to have a super...
We should just say that mindfulresistance.net is the website.
Yes, we should say that. For people who want to sign up for the newsletter, even on an experimental basis, that's where you would go to sign up for it. And there's also, if you Google mindful resistance, you'll get there, and you will also see high in the search results this piece I wrote for Vox on kind of what mindful resistance is. And then that would be Grumpkin.
Yeah. No, she's not being very mindful right now.
No, but she seems to be disappearing. Moving on to things more interesting to a cat. So that's the deal. It's funny, as not long before we taped this David Brooks column appeared that could be taken as in some ways advocating mindful resistance, right?
Yeah, so the piece that ran today, January 8th, the decline of anti-Trumpism is the headline, and he kind of makes the argument that the resistance, and although he doesn't say explicitly, the never Trump conservatives are not being as effective as they could because they're not seeing the Trump administration for what it truly is, not giving it some of the credit for increased professionalization that he sees. And the choice line was, he says, more anti-Trumpers seem to be telling themselves a madness of King George narrative. Trump is a semi-illiterate madman surrounded by sycophants who are morally, intellectually, and psychologically inferior to people like us. I'd like to think it's possible to be fervently anti-Trump while also not reducing everything to a fairy tale.
Right. And that was Grumpkin again. If for people who are just listening to the audio podcast, when you hear a sound that sounds like disturbance, it's probably Grumpkin the cat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny, you know, David Frum wrote a piece that you took, I think correctly, to be a reply to the Brooks column. He didn't mention Brooks, but he seemed to be dismissing people who didn't see the need for more or less constant outrage. Is that an unfair way to put it?
Yeah, I think he was critiquing Brooks without naming him, as saying that Brooks was trying to accommodate himself to Trump, and other people who are saying, well, maybe it's not so bad, are falling into the authoritarian trap of things that once would have been outrageous becoming normalized. And he puts it in a way that corrosion versus crisis. He says, in a crisis, of course, we'll all be heroes, or so we assure ourselves. But in the muddy complexity of the slow misappropriation of the state for self-interested purposes, occasions for heroism do not present themselves. On the contrary, the rhetoric of resistance comes to seem disproportionate, strident, and cranky. But he says this is still needed.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with Frum that if Brooks is taken as saying, and I think in parts he is kind of saying this, that, you know, this presidency isn't turning out as badly as we thought, then I disagree. It's exactly as bad as, you know, I mean, it's super bad. And I think there is part of the Brooks column where he's speaking, and he's speaking partly from a conservative standpoint here, when he says, hey, he's gotten some things done, you know, and he alludes, I think, to the loosening the offshore drilling regulations, for example. Well, that's fine from a conservative point of view. So maybe that's why he's a little happier with the way things are turning out than I am. But I'm definitely with Frum that we shouldn't lose sight of how bad this is. But I think there's still some the danger of getting too emotionally wrapped up in it in a certain sense. And you know, Brooks makes the point that this Michael Wolff book comes out, and a lot of people in the resistance take it as gospel, whereas Wolff actually has a reputation as someone whose journalistic standards aren't, you know, exactly old-fashioned, and he plays it pretty loose, and in fact acknowledges as much in a kind of a preface to the book, I gather.
He said something like there were conflicting versions of the truth presented by various people in Trump's orbit, and since he didn't know which ones to believe, he
believed them all.
Yeah, but also he argued that the idea that like facts don't matter, the truth doesn't matter, alternative facts, as Kellyanne Conway put it, is like a key part of Trump's world. And so that was embodied by sort of believing everything and putting stuff in there that maybe he couldn't verify.
Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely agree with Brooks that there is a tendency and a temptation within the resistance to just believe the worst you hear about Trump and to interpret everything you see in the worst possible light. And I think the dementia thing is kind of a good example. I mean, it's funny. I remembered only today that when John Kerry was running for president, I don't know how old he would have been. I think he would have been in what, like his late 60s or something, or mid-late 60s? I don't know. He wasn't older than Trump is now. And I remember saying to somebody, a video of him doing congressional testimony when he was very young, in his 20s, surfaced. And I remember saying to somebody, wow, he was so much sharper and more articulate then than he is now. And whoever it was agreed. They had the exact same reaction independently. And we didn't jump to this dementia story. I mean, your brain gets slower as you get older, right? And my own view has been that Trump, if you look at these earlier tapes of him 30 years ago, he is not William Jennings Bryan. He never was. He's always spoken in a kind of a fragmentary way. Now, it's definitely gotten a lot worse, and it could well be dementia. I'm not ruling that out. I'm just using that as an example of how, if you dislike Trump as much as I do, your brain wants you to latch on to the most unflattering interpretation of everything. And I'm just, I do think that the dementia thing is kind of a case study. Mm-hmm. Just in that, I'm not saying there's anything particularly tactically disastrous about asserting that he's entering dementia. I'm not sure that. I just think this is a good example of how we latch on to, the preferred narrative without realizing that we're being drawn toward the narrative by our, you might say, prejudices.
Mm-hmm. The dementia thing is interesting to me. I personally believe that he is in the early stages of some kind of mental decline. I mean, he's a 71-year-old man. He's not going to be as sharp as a tack. But if you watch old videos of him, it's very different. He can speak cogently, and anytime he is asked to speak, or you see his words, his extemporaneous words written down, it just circles back on itself, incomplete sentences. So I do personally believe in it. And I think it does matter whether you think he is possibly mentally impaired, because it brings in the 25th Amendment thing, and whether that's something that people should organize around.
Yeah, that is relevant. Yep.
Whether mental impairment.
I will say that it's a questionable reading of the 25th Amendment that, anything like early stages of dementia would be grounds. But I don't mean questionable in the sense that it's wrong. It's something you could debate. The wording, the wording of the amendment, it was clearly kind of designed for out and out, pretty unequivocal incapacitation, like having a bullet in your head but not being dead.
Right. And this happened before in U.S. history. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke, and apparently his wife largely ran things without the public knowing. And Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I think, 7 years after leaving office. Mm-hmm. And people, after the fact, said that he seemed to be in the early stages of it in the late part of his second term. So, yeah, I think it. I mean, this gets to this question we've talked about before, which is crazy versus crazy like a fox.
Yeah, and this is the question of whether things interpreted as Trump being just unstable, bizarrely reactive, childlike, whether that's always the right interpretation, or whether sometimes what he's doing is actually a tactical provocation. I mean, that's actually a feature we had talked about putting in the newsletter. Crazy or crazy like a fox. just as a way of, and maybe this is a segue to talking about the input we've gotten from our faithful readers in the newsletter and responding to it. But one feature that we had independently, just without any reader encouragement, talked about having is this feature where you would take something Trump did and make both sides of the case. Like, okay, was this just him being borderline nuts, or was there a method to the madness? Mm-hmm. Did it serve some distractive purpose? Did it, or did it? And I think this does happen, whether it's intentional or not. Did it elicit such an outraged kind of media reaction that Trump can then take it and show it to his base and say, "See, the media hates me"? I think a lot of his outrages wind up serving that function, whether they're intended to or not. His kind of seemingly crazy behavior tends to elicit responses in social media and regular media that help keep his base convinced that the world is against him. And if you view his goal as being to avoid impeachment, then actually just keeping his base with him is job one. That's anyway. That speaking of features of the newsletter, why don't we move to things that people have kinds of input that readers have given us over the last week or two, and for starters, I guess we could start with one thing several people said. Brad, I won't mention last names. Brad said this, Elizabeth said this, and Sandra from Frigid, Minnesota, as she describes herself, said, some variant of, as Brad put it, the newsletter would be strengthened by offering examples of mindful resistance in action beyond checking our propensity to react to Trump and his supporters. What positive actions can we do? So, what do you think? This would be a good thing to include in the newsletter, right? Yeah,
it's tough. People have a lot of, mainly the things we've recommended are things not to do in the newsletter,
right?
And it's harder to think of proactive things we can take, proactive actions we can take. Absent an election, which is going to be coming up in 10 or so months. So I think it's something we need to work on, looking into organizations that are opposing Trump in a more mindful way, or what are the concrete things that an average citizen can do.
Right. Sandra from Frigid, Minnesota put a slightly finer point on it. She said, although I'm basically trying to keep calm through all of this, I also have the opposite impulse to do something, but I'm often unsure about what. It would be interesting to me to have a section in the newsletter that lists individuals, efforts, organizations, etc. that are doing things of interest to mindful resistors and could be worthy of their support. I don't know if you can keep that up every week and keep listing stuff that's worth doing, but there's definitely stuff like that, and I am not sufficiently tapped into it. I'm not an activist by background. But I know my sister-in-law does this thing, and we will in a future issue of the newsletter at least draw attention to this. There's some guy named Postcard. His nickname is Postcard Tom or something. Maybe I'm totally hallucinating. That's wrong. Forget I said it. But the point is, he has created this network of people who do these hand-addressed postcards that are sent to voters to encourage them to turn out. So in the Alabama election, my sister-in-law, between her and people that she mobilized, friends that she mobilized, she generated something like, it was like 5,000 to 10,000 hand-addressed postcards. I think the message was pre-written, maybe in an automated way, I forget. But there was a significant amount of individual work done on each postcard, and she generated, maybe this number is even too low, 5,000 to 10,000. It was a lot, and this guy who does this for elections like this is still doing it. So that's one thing you can do. Now, I should say, this is an interesting issue. He's I'm sure a Democrat, and his idea of opposing Trump is to support Democrats. And I think, honestly, in the case of the Alabama election, a lot of Republicans agreed that a lot of Republican anti-Trumpers agreed that the way to oppose Trump in that case was to support the Democrat.
Right.
But it raises a question about what the character of our movement is, and ostensibly it's just effectively opposing Trump. On the other hand, I can't disguise my own ideology, and it's not conservative. And that comes out in the things that I personally write in the newsletter. And I guess I should leave it at that. I welcome anti-Trumpers of all persuasions, but I'm not going to conceal my own motivating ideology. Anyway, there's certainly a lot of activities that I'm sure we could point to that would not have an ostensibly partisan cast. I mean, there are a lot of you look at the latest this thing with the people from El Salvador, right? Suddenly wanting to return 200,000 of them who have been living here in good standing with permission. I'm sure there are a whole lot of Republicans and conservatives who think that's not right, and so if we can draw attention to ways to oppose specific things, I think we should do that.
Here's a question I've had as we work on this project. How much are we opposing Trump? How much are we opposing Trumpism? Can you separate Trump from Trumpism?
Yeah.
Trump could be out of office if he loses the election, if he gets impeached, if he resigns, or if he becomes incapacitated or dead. And he doesn't seem to be a very healthy 71-year-old, so he could just keel over at any moment. Are we worried? And his administration is in some ways just a conventional Republican one. It's rolling back regulations, they cut taxes, they install people who are friendly to industry in places like the Interior Department and the EPA. If Trump will eventually exit the scene somehow,
yeah,
what happens then?
Well, it's interesting. In a way, that's what's giving anti-Trumpism, in a way, it may be giving it a more partisan cast, because the truth is that, David Frum, God bless him, is still an all-out opponent of Trump. But the truth is, I think his policies have turned out less threatening, some of his policies, to the kind of conservative that David Frum is, than might have been expected. Now, that's not to say that David isn't right to see him as a threat to the very, constitutional order and to the republic. I agree, but I think, Trump, the way he's maneuvered since entering office has made it tempting for conservatives to say he's not so bad. Because in many ways he's being co-opted by the conservative establishment, I think. And
right.
And I think in foreign policy he's been moving toward a neoconservative stance, and I think in domestic policy toward a plain old conservative stance. That was not a populist tax bill. So anyway, as for your question, do we oppose Trump or Trumpism, raises the further question, what do you mean by Trumpism? That was never so clear, right? I mean, if you mean the authoritarian vibe he gives off, we oppose that, and he continues to embody that, I would say.
Right.
If you mean the kind of ethno-nationalism, I oppose that, and he continues to embody some of that. He's on the immigration front. I think he's kind of stuck with his position, partly because Jeff Sessions, I think, is a true believer. But even though he hasn't gotten a wall built, he's made life very uncomfortable for not just people who are here illegally now, but people. A good example is the people from El Salvador who weren't here illegally. He just wants people like that to feel uncomfortable. And so that part of ethno-nationalism is intact. Now, on the other hand, The nationalism part, to the extent it means economic nationalism, that hasn't really materialized. He hasn't really started a bunch of trade wars. And, I mean, he didn't sign on to the TPP, but Hillary wasn't going to sign. Nobody was going to sign on to that. So, he's not the economic nationalist that... And by the way, there were a lot of people who would have welcomed that anyway, who were ardent Trump opponents. But the ethno part of ethno-nationalism he's sticking with. I would say the clash of civilization, the Islamophobia he's sticking with. Mm-hmm. And that's, in a way, part of ethno-nationalism, I guess you could say. And in a way, so anyway, he's I guess you could say he's sticking with the authoritarianism and the ethno part of ethno-nationalism, and that's a big chunk of what I would have called Trumpism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The weirdest thing about Trump, I think, and there's many weird things about him, is that he doesn't actually seem to know or care about policy and politics, really. Uh-huh. He has has authoritarian instincts. But the way it's been reported, anyone who goes into a meeting with him can get him to more or less agree with their position, and then it turns out it doesn't really matter. He just seems to not. Here comes the cat. He just seems to not really know enough to have
that was an intense special effect when your cat's tail just now went right into the camera. That was a pretty fine-grained glimpse of a cat's tail, I'm here to tell you. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think he firmly doesn't know or care enough about politics to have a consistent line. So if he was replaced with Pence, it would be worse in some ways because Pence is a committed ideologue.
That's why I'm not so excited about impeachment.
Pence... Right, but Pence is not a strongman authoritarian type in the way that Trump is or wishes he could be if he wasn't so incompetent.
I guess I don't know that much about Pence. I mean, I don't know him to be a man of. I haven't seen evidence that he's a man of principle, and if he's not, then he might.
He seems to me like a run-of-the-mill evangelical conservative, like not very different from George W. Bush.
Yeah, except in a way more rhetorically. Well, in a way more rhetorically effective because he was a talk radio host for a while. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I guess now this does lead to something that somebody else. Let's see who said this. Who raised the issue of policy? Somebody named Patrick says, but aside from general outrage at the problems, healthcare, immigration, tax reform, criminal justice, lack of world leadership, and so on, it doesn't seem to me that the left, say Democrats, have presented anything like serious and clear alternatives on these issues. That's another thing mindful resistance could be doing, is coming up with an agenda, a policy agenda, but you have to ask yourself to what end. There are two ways you could think of it. One is if you just wanted to elect Democrats to office. And by the way, I think there are Republicans who maybe not many, but there are some anti-Trump conservatives who might be in favor of Democrats taking over the House and the Senate because they want to see him impeached, or because they just think there needs to be a check on him should he try to do something like fire Mueller or something, right? Mm-hmm. So it's possible that you could be looking, even as a conservative, oddly, for policies that would help a platform that would help Democrats get elected. But in any event, there's a separate question. Is not like what is the agenda that would work for Democrats in the election, but rather what set of policies would actually address the issues whose failure to get addressed arguably got Trump elected president. So in other words, if you agree that stagnant wages for unskilled workers are a problem, if you agree that that helped him get him elected, that the opioid epidemic is an issue that helped him get elected, that that partly because of this stagnant wage issue, immigration is an issue that helped him get elected, and on and on and on. And resentment of coastal cosmopolitan elites is an issue that helped, blah, blah, blah. What agenda would you put together to address that? Leave aside how you would package it for the purposes of getting your candidate to embrace it and still get elected. Leave that aside. What are the policies? Mm-hmm. I kind of think that, in a way, that it's that challenge that is more naturally part of mindful resistance, partly because the first challenge, like what talking points will get alternatives to Trump elected, is just getting, it's so guaranteed to get discussed by so many people, right? Whereas addressing these more elusive issues like the impact of globalization and automation on the workforce and so on, these are deeper things that I don't hear anybody really talking about them. Do you?
Well, I feel like a lot of the energy on the left of center right now is coming from the far left and people signing on to Bernie Sanders's Medicare for All plan and embracing $15 minimum wage. So that kind of, like, much further left than Hillary Clinton ran politics seems to be ascendant right now among the Democrats. And I don't know, I have no idea whether that's a more effective strategy. Policies that either messaging-wise or substance-wise could combat Trumpism.
Yeah, well, I do think that I mean that could arguably fall into that second category of things that actually address the root causes of Trump's appeal. Because I do think a certain amount of it involved dissatisfaction with healthcare. And now it was, you might argue that Trump was dishonest in the way he attributed the problem to Obama. But that aside, if people were delighted with the health care they're getting, then then Obamacare would not have been an issue. So there was a felt need out there.
Yeah, and Trump said, he gestured towards some sort of Obamacare replacement that would be terrific and everyone would be covered. But that never materialized.
Yeah. No, he was going to repeal and replace. I remember that at the beginning he was talking extemporaneously, and he was kind of like, we may do it at exactly the same time, repeal and replace. Or there may be a little gap, but not much of a gap. Repeal and then replace. And it's like, oh, well, don't get me started. But
yeah, well,
the replace part hasn't exactly taken root.
He was asked something about healthcare in the last couple of days, and he said something about associations, and millions of people are now in associations. He was saying something that had no relevance, no connection to reality whatsoever. Maybe just something someone told him or he saw on Fox News. But he seemed to think that something had happened with healthcare in which people were in associations, was the word he used now. So again, it's just like he doesn't care about the policy at all. He just wants to be a winner, in my view.
Yeah. No, he wants to be a winner, and he wants people to pay attention to him. Anyway, there is my view is that what gave rise to Trumpism is rooted in really fundamental kind of tectonic shifts involving globalization, automation, and a lot of things that have dislocated people. And are rapidly changing the terms of everyday life. And so I think that's worth thinking about. And I personally plan to do more of it. And we do some of, in the newsletter, calling attention to work on some of these issues, academic work and so on. But we could probably stand to do more. Now what... So anyway, the action items thing, coming up with ideas about what people can actually do, we definitely need to get better at that. It may not happen right away, but we are vowing improvement on this front. We will get this done before Trump repeals and replaces. That's my vow. And before the wall is completely built. Now, there's a related, well, it's not necessarily related, but a couple of people well, there's people who ask for, first of all, guidance in terms of navigating everyday challenges, like the aforementioned Sandra from Frigid, Minnesota says, I would also like to see more information on research or serious analyses that provide insight on relevant, but perhaps more academic or general topics, such as how to talk with people who disagree with you, how people choose their issues, and so on. And wasn't there somebody else who raised that?
Yeah, someone wrote, sorry, I don't have the name, something I'd like to see in the newsletter, suggestions on how to convey subtly the key points of the newsletter to individuals not inclined to hear them. And someone else mentioned dealing with family members who are Trump supporters. Right.
Now that is tough. I mean, because I have a bunch of family members who supported Trump, and when I went to a family reunion where they outnumbered me, my tactic was to avoid mentioning the word Trump. That's how I handled it. And they knew enough not to bring it up because they knew that it would irreparably damage family relations if they got me into a discussion with them. But that's hard. Now, relatedly, I mean, that does kind of lead to something else in a way. So there are people who also... Well, here's one from Skylar, who says, I'd be interested in seeing more tips on directly applying mindfulness practices to daily life in Trump's America. And then she puts in parentheses, exercises, mantras, etc. So she's talking about kind of, I guess, meditative exercises. And there was somebody else who suggested maybe I should add or provide a link at the end of the newsletter to a brief guided meditation for mindful resistors. An optional built-in, then and there opportunity to quiet, meditate, and counteract the concentrated dose of political news just consumed. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think of that? Do you want to be the meditation teacher, Aryeh?
I'm not currently meditating. Well, I mean, I'm not currently, as we do this conversation, meditating, but I'm not an active meditator. So I probably wouldn't be good at it. But do you think, in the way that there are meditations in which you contemplate with loving kindness people who are opposed to your interests, do you think there's something like that we could use in the political realm?
I was distracted because my camera seems to be coming undone. I had this brilliant way of affixing it to my computer screen so that when I look at you, it would look like I would be looking into it. It was like a poor man's Errol Morris setup. But the woman in the hardware store's warning that I would never be able to get this off of my computer screen if I used the thing I bought there seems to have been quite off base because it hasn't even lasted 30 minutes, 35 minutes. With that distraction noted, I would say I don't remember what you said, but I remember what we're talking about.
Can there be a kind of meditation on one's political enemies, or a meditation on how to oppose Trump in a more mindful way?
I mean, my generic response to that, this is the sound of duct tape, by the way. Duct tape to the rescue. My general feeling on that is that the kind of meditation you do to be a mindful resistor, if you choose to do meditation in an attempt to be a mindful resistor, is just mindfulness meditation. I mean, in theory, mindfulness meditation should equip you to handle life's emotional challenges with more equanimity than you would otherwise muster. And that's the mindset we strive for, right? Is to not be too emotionally reactive to Trump, to remain calm enough to be able to view him, objectively. And so I think my basic reaction to questions about meditative exercises is, do mindfulness meditation. Now, how to do that effectively is a whole subject in and of itself, but there's certainly a literature on it. There are apps, the 10% Happier app. I just had Dan Harris, who's got a new meditation book out, Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. I just had him on the podcast, and that's an example of a place you could go for that. Now, that said, while you're meditating, you could actually think of Trump. That's an interesting challenge. You focus on your breath, you get a little mindful and so on, and then do the exercise of thinking about him, observe the emotional reaction that rises up, and try to observe it mindfully. Don't run away from it. Don't get too involved in it. Just observe it. That I would say that could be a good exercise. But I would say that every week. So it's not like, it's not like I could come up with a new exercise every week and as for mantras, that's just not part of the kind of meditation I've done, which is mindfulness. There are mantra-based. Is it mantra or mantra? My wife was making fun of my pronunciation, but I can't remember which pronunciation I was using.
I thought it was mantra, but
okay, then I must have been that I said mantra, and she made fun of me. Now, but speaking of which, there's somebody, let me find this. Heidi wrote, I think it's possible to resist Trump and Trumpism from a place of compassion. I genuinely think we can and should impeach with compassion. That would be a good bumper sticker. Impeach with compassion. Maybe that should be our first thing we offer in the Mindful Resistance store.
Yeah, the merchandise. We haven't gotten to the merchandise stage yet of this.
No, we haven't.
Recipient movement.
We haven't.
But that brings me to something else that we've tried to emphasize, which is, the idea of compassion. And I think we've tried to emphasize seeing things from the point of view of Trump supporters and not viewing Trump supporters as some alien other, or trying to counter we've tried to counter the tribalism that Trump evokes on both sides.
Right. And I want to emphasize, seeing things from their point of view, the point isn't so much to feel their pain or anything. That's fine if you want to do it, but the point is just to understand. It's more of a cognitive empathy than an emotional empathy, just to understand where they're coming from. And that's why, when somebody else who wrote in mentioned not compassion but actual love, maybe I'll be able to find that. I was impressed. But I would say, in my view, it's nice if you get that far, I guess, but I don't think you really have to. If you can just look at Trump and Trump supporters just without a negative emotional reaction, just without getting wrapped up in dislike of them, if you can just view the situation objectively, I think that's victory. Now, if you do that, if you really do that in a thoroughgoing way, I think that may well lead to compassion. But I have not personally had much success trying to cultivate compassion per se through meditation. There is a meditation called loving kindness meditation. I don't seem to be very good at it. And that does involve the intentional cultivation of compassion. But I think just pure garden variety mindfulness does lead you to a place where compassion will be easier to access. But from my point of view, the main thing is that it leads you to a place where your vision is just no longer warped by dislike and, highly aversive emotional reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, by the way, says a Buddhist. A number of the people who wrote in are meditators and or identify as Buddhists. Michelle says, It's easy to avoid what's unpleasant, but a Buddhist doesn't cross the road to avoid an unpleasant encounter. So thank you for helping people like me mindfully face what's going on. That is a true that's true. That a big part of Buddhism is you don't shun the unpleasant. You deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's another whole theme in the feedback that is in the category of, well, a couple of people, Dave and David, two different people, said similar things. Dave said it would be good to have, quote, an opportunity for lay people such as myself to submit to your newsletter. David said, I really hope that Mindful Resistance grows into a blog. I see two compelling reasons for such a development. Newsletter is great, but so far it has essentially had only one voice, that of Robert Wright. Of course, this is a voice well worth listening to, David writes, thus redeeming the earlier part of his sentence. But I believe that for Mindful Resistance to become the incubator for ideas that it ought to be, the incubator that it ought to be, it will require a number of authors offering different viewpoints and so on, arguing over what constitutes mindfulness and resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Then he says, David says, second, I think a comment section would be a great addition, perhaps as important as the blog itself. So these are two different ways that readers of the newsletter could provide input. One is to a kind of a blog that he imagines, and another is as a comment, in a kind of a comment section. Now, do you have views on this?
Someone else wrote in saying the newsletter should not be on Facebook because the Facebook encourages mindlessness, not mindfulness.
Right.
And we're so far an email newsletter is the product. So I'm not sure. Having more voices, I think, is interesting. Having reader feedback be a part of it, but then you have the the issue where the kind of people who are moved to provide reader feedback are maybe not representative of the in the form of an online comment section, are not representative of the group as a whole. So I guess I'm kind of torn.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge. It's so challenging that I'm going to actually have to go get more coffee. So can you entertain while I'm gone? You can just say anything that comes to your mind. Any, like, recommendations for, I don't know, what are you watching on TV these days? I'll be right back.
My wife and I are watching The Crown season 2, which is pretty good. Yeah, that's about it. Hopefully we'll cut this part.
Okay, well, the good news for you is that I'm back already. Yeah, user input. I mean, I think there's a related thing, which is just like, and I think one of them, I think David, if not Dave, mentions there's no way for readers to get in touch with one another. And a comment section is that. It's one way. And I do think we need to provide the opportunity for people who want to do that. I think we need to think carefully about what form it takes. Because, comment sections are notoriously prone to becoming cesspools. Now, I think in this case, that would be less likely because, well, it depends on how you set it up, actually. I mean, I think he mentioned the possibility of a subreddit on the Reddit site that I'm not all that familiar with, but know of. And with a subreddit, I would imagine you would be, you could have kind of drive-by. You could get input from people who had no familiarity with the newsletter. I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on a Facebook page, if you had to join before commenting, which I guess can be the deal, if you use that as the forum, that might be that might have pros and cons. So there are different ways to do this, and I think we want to do some version of it, but we need to think a little about how you do it in a way that that does does meet the needs of the people who want it done, and ideally build community, and ideally, I mean, to get back to the blog idea and the idea of Dave that of a way for people to submit to the newsletter. I mean, leave aside for the moment whether it appears in the actual newsletter or whether there is something called a blog or whether that the newsletter links to or what. But the point is that user input, it can be more than, if you think of a comment section where just a bunch of people blow off steam, it can be more than that. It can be an incubator of ideas that then are disseminated among the group if they seem like ideas that the group would be interested in and that would be productive. And this takes us back to things like, for example, the idea of action items, like things you can go do proactively. You can imagine something that serves as a clearinghouse where people say, well, this is what they're doing in my community, or this is what I read about in this other newsletter, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so that, and you have a system where the things that are going to be found most useful by most people actually come to the attention of most people, whether it's because they get voted up or whatever. So, and everything we've talked about, in principle, whether it's coming up with policies or coming up with these, these action items, any form of good idea can be amenable to a kind of crowdsourcing, mm-hmm. And so I think, we should take that very seriously. I think the newsletter itself you have to try to keep it fairly tight and with a fairly coherent identity. That's my view of newsletters. But there can be all kinds of things, that we can have a blog, we can have all kinds of places, and we can feature highlights of the blog in the newsletter, right? That can mm-hmm. happen too. So I just want to convey that we're open to all kinds of stuff here.
Yeah, it's still the early days of this. I think we've done about 20 issues, and we're still exploring what we hope it can become.
Yeah, no, we started in August. So it's been going about 5 months. I think we're putting together the 23rd newsletter now. And it's, it's grown. We have over 5,000 subscribers now, and there's been growth basically every week. But it is early days, and this could have. I hope it will evolve into much more than it is. The idea wasn't just to have a newsletter. So I hope the newsletter will become richer and acquire some of these things that people are asking for. But I also hope that this will move beyond a newsletter per se. You can imagine actual physical meetups among people in the community. I don't think we have enough people in the community now so that you could say, like, I'm in Midland, Texas, and I want to get together at the Starbucks and have 20 people show up. I used to live in Midland, by the way. So I speak from authority. But I that would be, that would be a sign of things going well if that happened, Mm-hmm. Now here from, is it, I can't do the opening syllable here. Chaim. You tell me, how was that?
Yeah, that was okay.
Chaim. You give me the best pronunciation of that.
Chaim, I would say.
Oh, you just go with a straight H.
I put a little into it.
Oh, not as much as I put into it. Okay. Anyway, He says, I don't have questions, just wanted to express my gratitude. And by the way, a lot of people express gratitude, which is very gratifying, and we're grateful for that. But he goes on to say, I'd love to help, even if it's with menial tasks. If there's ever any dirty work to be done, my email is, and he gives it. Well, I mean, you need only glance around my office. No, actually, I don't think he has that kind of work in mind. But, you know, we were talking about maybe having, like if we did have a subreddit, you need a moderator, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need, there are various, you know, or if we had a comments section, you might need somebody to review comments that are flagged as inappropriate or something. So there would be things for people who want to help out to do, even if they don't aspire, as David did, to become one of the contributors to the blog. And we should say that David is actually somebody who's a little bit of a known quantity, because we know from Blogging Heads TV and Meaning of Life TV, which you and I are also involved in, that he's, if I've got the story right, he's a philosophy grad student, PhD student, PhD candidate, and an expert on Kant. Okay. Anyway, yeah, you're right. It was Karen who said, thank you for making the newsletter an email item and not making it a Facebook item. But, you know, if we do decide, you know, I mean, we do need to think carefully about the pros and cons of things like a Facebook page versus other things. And that's going to take a little while, but we're on the case. Let's see, other little. Do you have other people whose comments you wanted to flag?
No, I think we covered the ones. Yeah, we covered the main topics that I flagged.
Now there is a Dave. I don't know if it's one of the other Daves who thought it would be cool to have. He doesn't use the term, but kind of a taxonomy of tribes. He says, I would like to see some discussion on the nature of the perceived tribes. Separate them out. Not call them out in some negative fashion, but show the angles. Perhaps one a month. Tribes forming due to religious, political, and so on. It just made me think like a taxonomy of the tribes in the world. You know, ideological and so on would be an interesting thing. I think it's beyond the short-term scope of our endeavors, given what else we have on the agenda, but it's a... it's an idea. Pamela says, I signed up to read your newsletter to get a different perspective, so please don't hold back. I'm not sure what she thinks we are holding back, but I won't hold back. I will no longer hold back. Whenever I feel the impulse to hold back, I'll say, no, screw it.
Guns a-blazing.
Yeah. She says, and please just skip reporting something Trump does if you don't add your perspective. Now, relatedly, Joyce says, I subscribed to your newsletter a few weeks ago with the expectation, perhaps incorrect, that it would focus on reflecting mindfully on, for lack of a better phrase, current events. So far, it seems to be a general roundup of mostly Trump-related news, which I already get from other sources. I would like to see more content about mindful resistance, as the name implies. This gets partly at the question of what that opening section, The Week in Trump, is and is supposed to be, right?
Yeah. And it's changed a little bit. I think when we started, we were thinking it would be, you know, in an age when there's so many partisan news sources and it can feel like everyone's working an angle. We wanted to be as objective as possible, and it's taken on a little bit more of an editorial voice since then. But what the way I see it is providing the big stories of the week with an accurate roundup and trying to focus on the things that actually did matter and not the sound and fury signifying nothing that Trump often creates in his wake.
Right. Yeah, and it's an ongoing challenge, and I have to figure it out. It's like in last week's, it was like, well, when Trump did that nuclear button tweet, well, that is, you know, it is news. I mean, it's not traditional presidential behavior. At the same time, he does crazy stuff like this so often, you start wondering, are you doing, you know, him a favor by focusing on that? In any event, in that case, as it happened, what was, I think, a more important development in the same realm was that the two Koreas agreed to talk. And so I tried to focus a little more on that. But it is a challenge. And so, too, with the Wolf book, in a way. It was like, you know, the Wolf book unleashed this soap opera involving Bannon and Trump. And is that all just a distraction? And I kind of decided, well, no. I mean, Bannon has been taken as like the guardian of the ethno-nationalist, imperative. And he had styled himself as this guy who was going to keep Trump honest in that regard. And if he's undergoing a massive loss of power, I thought that was a significant development. But it is a challenge figuring out what to focus on. But we certainly, what you said is kind of the idea. I think it's a combination of trying to focus on the genuinely important and not get wrapped up too much in the sound and fury. And increasingly, I think there is a little bit of kind of attitude or kind of editorial, well, or at a minimum, analytical. There's an analytical dimension to it. And that maybe that gives it a kind of a voice. But anyway, that's the idea. I can certainly understand why people might have questions about it, and we'll continue to indulge those questions, and we can continue to encourage them. Let's see, what else? I want to just thank quickly 3 people. Ellen, they all wrote in about my white women in Alabama the middle section of the newsletter is always something by me with my name attached to it. And I wrote this thing about white women voters in Alabama after the Alabama election. Ellen wrote in, Margaret wrote in, and the third person, either June or June M. I think M is maybe a middle initial, although, given that she signs the thing at the end, sent from Venus, it could be June M. It could be the June, Junem is a more common name on Venus. But anyway, they all wrote in, very thoughtfully in response to that. This isn't the place to respond to the responses, except to say that my point certainly wasn't to defend or embrace the position of these particular Alabama white women on things like abortion, so much as to try to illuminate what their perspective is on it, and how we can explain people voting for Roy Moore without thinking the very worst of them. That they are just racist, or they are just this, or they are just that. Which is a big dimension of this whole thing, I think, is to try to resist the temptation to essentialize, people that you disagree with, see essence of bad person in them. Mm-hmm. I'm just thumbing through my notes to see if there's anything else. We've already gone over an hour, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another question I have that I'm still trying to work over my mind, and this is kind of like relates to the Fire and Fury book, which a lot of even liberals are saying is unfair to Trump and maybe is just passing off gossip without verifying it. I'm wondering whether it's kind of like, should we be fair to Trump when Trump is not fair to his opponents? He likes to fight dirty. He calls people names. Yeah. He will say things that aren't true, whether he knows it's not true or not is hard to tell. Should Trump's opponents be holding back or not? Should they be giving as good as Trump gives in order to oppose him, or should they be holding themselves to a higher standard and trying to reimpose, a standard, like some kind of ethic of good behavior that Trump violates?
Well, this issue came up, first of all, in the aforementioned David Brooks column. He was kind of like, aren't we better than Michael Wolff's standards of journalism? Isn't this beneath us? It also came up kind of in another context. So there was this thing, Trump went to the college football championship game, was singing the national anthem, or at least at times it seemed he was singing the national anthem, and people couldn't tell. Like, did he keep forgetting the words? Was he distracted? It was kind of odd, I have to admit. I mean, because sometimes he was singing the words, but most of the time he wasn't. And so this became like a meme, like Trump doesn't know the words of the national anthem. And I saw a couple of, I may include these in the newsletter. There was a tweet by Tony Karen saying, I can't, showing the homepage of The Guardian with a piece about Trump doesn't seem to know the words of the national anthem. And Tony was like, are we really focused on this while he's busy deporting 200,000 people to El Salvador? And that seems to me like, a mindful resistor kind of thing to say. Then I saw a tweet from the veteran journalist Jeff Greenfield saying, well, I don't often, something, I forget how he set it up, but he said it's certainly true that if Obama had done this, it would have been 24/7 on Fox News. And I kind of thought my series of reactions was, well, wait a second, aren't we better than Fox News? I mean, but then I thought, on the other hand, you could say, well, Fox News got the job done. This last election, they won. I mean, so you might say tactically, it makes sense to do stuff like this. I mean, my own view is like, when in doubt about the tactical value of something, just go with what seems right. I mean, it's like, I'm not saying necessarily answers how you should handle this national anthem thing, but I try to be mindful of when we seem to be stooping to the level of Trump and try to not do that. But there is the argument that, look, if you defeat Trumpism by stooping to his level, you have not really defeated Trumpism in a very thoroughgoing sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, like we said before, he hasn't been able to enact, really authoritarianism, but he has been able to shift the mores and affect, make the national discourse much, much worse. And yeah, I'm still somewhat personally torn about it, but I guess maybe I need to meditate on that.
Yeah, I know I'm torn about a lot of stuff. And this is one reason that there will be value in getting a lot more systematic reader input, as several people have asked for, in a way that's visible to other people in the community. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be a priority to do some version of that. Not going to happen in the next couple of weeks. We want to think about it carefully. But if we don't have some kind of, plan in 6 to 8 weeks, then we should be impeached.
With compassion.
Yeah, with compassion. Impeach with compassion. That's a new motto. Okay, anything else? I mean, I was really gratified by, and we didn't have to, there were a bunch of other things that came in, but we could only address so many of them. Tried to capture the main themes that were raised by people, but we're very appreciative when people write in, not just in response to the question of, well, how can the newsletter improve, but write in about anything. I mean, the email address is feedback@mindfulresistance.net, right?
I think that's right.
And the place to sign up for the newsletter, again, is just go to mindfulresistance.net. And there, if you go to the bottom of that page, by the way, you can click and see the archives of the newsletter if you're curious about what you'll be getting yourself into. Okay, and also, should we plug anything of yours? People should listen to Culturally Determined. Yeah,
Culturally Determined. You can subscribe on iTunes, or if you're already subscribed on iTunes, the blogging heads, you'll get the episodes. Mm-hmm. As well, recently had a good conversation about the 20th anniversary of the movie Titanic with the writer Sarah Marshall. So check that out.
Right. And you can also subscribe to the whole Blogging Heads feed or the whole Meaning of Life TV feed and so on. I guess we will see people in the newsletter then. Thanks for this and all the other stuff you do, Aryeh.
Thanks, Bob.
See you.
See ya.